Thank you. I'm very glad that Rachel started that day out really positively, because I'm going to throw you back into negativity. The rest of the day will all be very good, positive sessions about wonderful APIs that will really help us create better websites. Mine is not. Mine is basically the one that you don't want to run into. I'm going to talk about form validation. Who here loves form validation? Oh, a few, okay. Most of you don't, and that's for a good reason. The idea of this presentation actually came from a conversation with Krijn, who's my fellow organizer here. And we talked back and forth about what I should do, a talk and so on. And then we said, okay, we could do something about the modern form validation stuff. And I said, yeah, I like that. So I went to work and I started to test, and I basically found out the stuff I'm going to show you. So then we decided, okay, you can present this, but there has to be some positive upbeat note somewhere. As far as I know, there are 2 positive upbeat notes in this presentation. If you don't listen carefully, you'll miss them, but I'll probably warn you about that. And also there is some practical, there are some practical guidelines at the end. They are not amazingly wonderful or something, but they are practical guidelines because you're supposed to end your presentation on that. With that said, form validation. The really weird part is that this is literally the oldest trick in the JavaScript book. I mean, if you know your web history, you know that Netscape 2 was the first browser to support JavaScript ever. It came out in 1996, if I remember correctly. And basically, the only thing you could do with it was form validation. And that is only with alerts and stuff. So it's the oldest trick in the book. It's 20 years old, and we still haven't got it right. Because form validation used to depend on you writing a script and going through the form and figuring out if the user had filled in correct stuff and so on and so on. It was all completely a custom script. By default, the browser did absolutely nothing. With the advent of the modern input type, as I call them, well, they're, I don't know, 7, 8 years old by now, but I still call them the modern input types, like date and email and making fields required and so on. That changed because having this kind of stuff in the browser doesn't always make sense if the browser doesn't tell the user that something is wrong. So that means that all these modern input types are automatically validated by the browser. And automatically the browser creates native error messages when it's necessary. That your own validation script only kicks in after the browser has validated this for itself. And in some browsers, your script doesn't even kick in if the browser finds a mistake. And you can turn all of this off by setting the no validate attribute on a form. I'm kind of assuming that all of you know that already, but I want it to be complete, so I put it in my presentation. So this is a native error message, right? Just to be absolutely clear, this is what I mean. This is the stuff that the browser itself generates. This particular one is in Chrome, and it's a text for a required field. I haven't filled anything in the field. I press submit. The browser said, hey, please fill in this field. This is native form validation. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about in this presentation is 2 modern techniques. Well, modern is not really the word, but the really weird part is not all that many people are using all this modern form validation. And I'm getting the feeling that part of the reason is that the validation doesn't always work properly. Anyway, I'm going to talk about CSS valid and invalid, 2 pseudo-classes. And I'm going to talk about Constraint Validation API, which is a part of the HTML5 specification. That all sounds great, and you would think it solves all our problems, but it actually does not. And I am going to tell you why not. Before we actually start, one more thing, very important, this. Always validate your forms server-side. Do I need to explain that to anyone? Good. You never know. You never know. Okay, I prepared a few examples for you. They are at coursemode.org/forms. It would be wise if you opened that page on one of your devices now, because throughout this presentation I'm going to refer to it a few times. Also, this research of mine was graciously sponsored by Samsung Internet. Who here knows what Samsung Internet is? Okay, we have to do something about that. You all had a drink, right, before you came up? And you found it tasted slightly funny, and during the day you will get this uncontrollable urge to also test your websites in Samsung Internet. That is completely normal, don't worry about it. We've got it all in the pocket. In fact, Ada from Samsung Internet is here, and she will introduce it to you further. I tested all my stuff in Samsung Internet and many other browsers. Before I get to my test results, I would like to briefly talk about what we actually want. What is the purpose of this whole form validation? How can we make our websites more user-friendly? On the page I prepared, please view the what we want example. This is a quick demo I hacked. At the very end of the presentation, I'm going to show you how it works. It's not really groundbreaking or anything, but I thought I'd make clear how I personally feel that form validation should work. You will probably quibble with one or two of the details. That's absolutely fine. I mean, it's just a rough guideline. Also, if you're looking for design, it's not there. I'm not a designer, I'm sorry. So what exactly are we trying to achieve here? As far as I'm concerned, the ideal form does the following. It gives a visual clue when a field is valid or invalid, and of course we use CSS for that. It places any error messages that should be necessary directly next to the field, probably above the field or below the field, because if you actually place it to the right of the field, you may run into problems on small screens. But it should be clearly associated with the field. And there are plenty web forms where the error messages are not clearly associated with the field. You know, or all these bulleted lists at the top of a form, you did this wrong, you did that wrong. It's terrible. If you show an error message, place it right next to the field. And it validates an individual field onblur. Okay, so what do I mean by that? We have to briefly talk about validation timing here. The question is exactly when do you validate a form field? There are roughly 3 options. The most traditional one is on submit. That is, if the user submits the form, then you go through all the form fields and figure out if they're valid or not. The disadvantage of that is that it's too late. In general, especially if you have huge forms, you want to get immediate feedback. If you press the submit button and then you have to scroll all the way to the top of the form to figure out what's wrong, then that's not a very good user interface. So unsubmit has its uses, but in general it's too late. The exact opposite of that is onkey press. That is, you validate the form field every single time the user changes something, i.e. presses a key. This is way too soon, and it happens way too many times, so I don't like it either. That's where we get to the onblur timing, which basically means if the user leaves the form field, the user indicates, hey, I'm ready with this form field, right? And then we should immediately run a validation script that says, yeah, it's valid, go on, or no, it's invalid, here's your error message. So I vastly prefer onblur validation timing. Unsubmit does have its uses. If you look at the example I made, you will see that it also kind of works when you press the submit button. It's a kind of a fallback, that's fine. But onblur is really the sweet spot here. By the way, if you go back to my index page that I prepared, I also have links to 3 articles I wrote about this subject. The first article contains a fairly detailed discussion of all of this, including links to research. I'm not going to go into that right now, so you have to take my words that onblur is the best timing. Okay. So we would expect CSS and the API to use onblur timing, right? Well, no, they don't. The API is based on unsubmit timing, which, as far as I'm concerned, is wrong when you use only unsubmit timing. CSS uses onkey press timing, which is way more wrong, because it's terrible, and I'm going to show you in a minute. Because if you go to the CSS validation test page and you run the first test, the first test is just pure valid and invalid. There's nothing else. If you try to fill in the correct value there, you will see that at first it says, oh, I'm invalid. And then when you press the very last character, only then it says, OK, now I'm valid. As far as I'm concerned, this is a very bad user interface design, because it can confuse people. And besides, it could change all the time, potentially. So, valid and invalid work on key press. There are also a few more pseudo-classes in CSS that have to do with form validation, for instance, out of range, but I'm going to ignore them because they're basically specific, more specific cases of valid and invalid. Excuse me. So what we have here is a validity of a form field that's re-evaluated on every keystroke, which is bad. So can we move this to what I call onblur timing? Yes, we can. Also, there's one more problem, that in CSS there's no indeterminate state. That is, personally, I would feel if you enter the form, if you come to the form for the first time and the page loads, a field should be neither valid nor invalid, but just say, OK, you haven't interacted with me yet, so I don't know what I am. That is missing from pure CSS form validation. So, how do we move pure CSS form validation to onblur? Fortunately, it's very simple. This is one of the two positive and upbeat slides, so pay close attention. This is the trick. An invalid field that does not have to focus. Simple as that. You can try that in the second example on the CSS validation page. There you will, and that runs with not focus, and you will see that while you are typing, the field is just white. It doesn't show either valid or invalid. And that helps up to a point. Anyway, remember this trick. It's fairly useful. What we're basically doing here is that while the user is typing, we give the form field an indeterminate state. We cannot yet say whether it's valid or invalid. And as far as I'm concerned, that's a good thing. Of course, what it does not do is give the form field an indeterminate state when the page loads. When the page loads, it still says, hey, I'm valid, or hey, I'm invalid, which is a pity. And as far as I know, we cannot actually solve this problem with CSS alone. So, still, we have created 2 of the 3 properties of the ideal form. We give a visual clue when a field is valid or invalid, and we validate if an individual field onblur. Now, how do we place error messages directly next to the form field? When I was doing my research, I was very naive, and I thought, oh, that will be easy. Oh, that's nice. Yes, I had a great idea. How do we do an error message in CSS? I thought like this. We take a simple data error attribute on the field, and we show that after the field when the input is invalid, and that would be it. And we add some nice styling, of course, to make it look nice. But this would be the basic idea. Alas, alas, this does not work. Why not? Because input before and input after are not supported. This is actually according to the specification, because the specification says that replaced elements do not have a before and an after. And an input is one of the replaced items, which is a pity. Still, it gets weirder. Because although theoretically input colon before and input colon after are not supported, in practice they are sometimes. They're only supposed not to be supported. Because in Chrome and Safari, this works on checkboxes, radios, and ranges. A range is a slider, right, with a button that you slide. That's an input type equals range. In Chrome and Safari on iOS, but of course not in Safari on Mac, it also works on the date-related types. Input type equals date, week, month, and so on. Why this exception to the rule? I have absolutely no clue. I just don't know. This is one of the weird things that you sometimes find out when you're doing browser compatibility research. So how do we do an error message instead? Something like this, probably. this will work, right? The input, a span after it, and if it's invalid, you show the span. Which is fine, which will work. It has one disadvantage though, you're forced to put the span after the input. While sometimes you actually want to put the error messages before the inputs. You can work around that as well, but this is the best we can do right now. Now, if you look at the third example on the CSS validation test page, you will see the final problem that we have with CSS validation. The third example has required, so it's a required field, and a required field without a value is invalid. Which means that as soon as the page loads, the browser immediately says, oh yeah, you're invalid. And we would not like that to happen, because we would prefer it to be indeterminate. But as I said before, we can't do that with CSS. However, oh, this is what I just explained. There's a proposed solution in the works, and it's called input user invalid, or input user error, if you follow the WAT working group. As far as I know, it's not yet supported. But it basically means if the field is invalid, even after the user has interacted with it. And in the W3C specification, it even says if the user has interacted with it significantly. The question is, of course, what does that mean exactly? I don't know, because it's not supported yet, so I haven't tested it. But I think we will have plenty of browser incompatibility fun with figuring out exactly what user invalid means, once 2 or more browsers support it. However, it's definitely a solution to the problem, and I hope it will be implemented speedily. So far we have talked about valid and invalid on input fields. Did you know that valid and invalid also work on forms? A form is valid when all of the fields inside that form are found to be valid. And if even one of them is invalid, the entire form is invalid. This is kind of interesting, and I didn't know that before I started my research. I'm not totally sure if it's practical. The next one may be slightly more practical, because the same happens with field sets. A field set, right, which is meant to create a set of fields in the forms. And it turns out that valid and invalid are supported in field sets as well, except in Edge. So that's interesting. Now, what we would really like, if we have forms, if we have field sets, we would really like valid and invalid to be supported on labels as well, because I absolutely love labels. Unfortunately, that is not the case. Why not? I have no clue. This is the kind of thing I go through when I do browser compatibility research, right? Oh, this should work. Oh, it doesn't work. Why not? I don't know. Okay, next problem. And then I get drunk in the evening and try to forget. But then I woke up in the morning and say, oh, I have to write a presentation about that. Okay, I'll bring you down. I'll really bring you down as well. So, the reason why I love labels is this. This is my absolute favorite way of building up a form. You just put the input inside the label, and you can also add the text that the user is seeing and potentially an error message. You don't need the for attribute here, because obviously the label is about the input that's inside of it. And in general, you want your form fields to form a little block, right? You have one form field with an accompanying text. You want that to be one block, followed by a next block, followed by a next block. You don't have to put that in divs or sections or whatever. You can just use a label, because you can just set a label to display block and it will work absolutely fine. So this is why I love labels, and this is why I would like labels to have the valid and invalid pseudo-classes as well, but they don't. Too bad, let's move on. Oh, and when we talk about error messages, we could do just this, right? Label invalid span, and now it doesn't matter where the span is, before or after the input field. But again, this does not actually work, so don't try this at home. Okay, we have seen that CSS form validation works kind of okay-ish. We would like some more features, but the basics are there. It needs to be triggered onblur, and not on key press. It needs user invalid, the invalid but only when the user has interacted with it. It needs label invalid and label valid. And I would like the browsers to take a decision on input before and input after. I would prefer it to work everywhere, but if you say no, we can't, then please make sure it does not work anywhere. In any case, please be consistent. And we also need to figure out something about an indeterminate state, when a form field is not yet validated. That will probably be partly part of user invalid, but we have to see. So the state of CSS form validation it's kind of interesting, and you can do some simple tricks with it, but for the really heavy lifting, it's not really suited yet. Let's move to JavaScript, the Constraint Validation API, which is a part of the HTML5 specification. Before we start talking about the actual API, let's try to briefly define what we would like the API to be. As far as I'm concerned, the ideal API figures out if a field is invalid and why. Well, duh, of course. But you know, you should never take this kind of stuff for granted, especially not when you do browser compatibility research. You have to be able to rewrite a native error message, because in general, the native error messages, the text of the native error messages is kind of okay, but kind of generic. And there are plenty of cases where you would like to rewrite that text. And you have to figure out, you have to have a way of telling the browser exactly when to show a native error message, right? So this is what we would like the Constraint Validation API to do. Can it do this? Kind of, but not really. I'll tell you why. Let's start with the first point. We have to figure out if a field is valid or invalid and why. There's two ways in the API to check the validity of a field. The first is each field has a validity property, which in turn has a bunch of other properties that tell you what's wrong with the field. And secondly, we have a check validity method, which does not tell you what's wrong. It just says true or false, this field is valid or invalid. As far as I'm concerned, the check validity method is rather useless, because we have a much better way of checking our validity. These are the validity properties, and this is the second slide that has a positive and upbeat note, because this actually works. Incredible, I know, you won't believe me, but really, believe me, I tested this and it works. Although there is something very weird with too long and too short. I'm not going to go into that, although on the example page I created, you will find a bonus bug at the very bottom of the page, where you will find something interesting. But I'm not going to go into that. The rest of it works absolutely fine. Of course, valid is the most generic one. Is this field valid, yes or no? And then you can go through all these properties to figure out exactly what is wrong. Pattern mismatch, for instance, means that the field has a pattern attribute, but the value does not conform to that. Range underflow means it is a number field, but the number in it is too low, and so on and so forth. In my, I think it's the second article that you find a link to, I have a complete list of these properties and exactly how they work. In any case, they do work, which is kind of cool. So you can figure out the validity of your form fields. Okay, let's talk about rewriting native error messages. Is that possible? Yes, actually it is. Because we have the set custom validity method that you can call on any field. You pass it a string, and that string becomes the new error message. Sounds cool, right? Sounds really like, yeah, we could really totally use that in our website. Problem is, it does something else as well. It also sets the field to invalid regardless of its value. Really, yes. This is, of course, horrible API design. Setting the value of an error message, great idea. Setting a field to invalid might not be a bad idea either. If you have a complicated custom script that checks something in your business logic or something, and you find out, okay, what the user has said here is wrong, I will mark the field as invalid, and I will push it off to the Constraint Validation API to actually show the error message, and so on and so forth. That is a good idea. Both of them are good ideas, but they should not be in the same method. Browser compatibility research for you. If you set custom validity with an empty string, it resets the error message to the default, and it removes the invalid lock. In other words, then the browser can figure out whether it's valid or invalid according to the normal rules. What happens if you use set custom validity without an argument whatsoever? It gives an error, because obviously this is not the same as that, and we absolutely positively need an empty string there. Bad API design. Okay. There's one more way of rewriting error messages, and there's sometimes a bit of confusion around this. You can set a simple title with an error message or a help message, but such a title works only on fields with a pattern attribute. It works nowhere else. So if you actually have a pattern, you can use this. But you should also be aware that it adds this text to the native error message text of the browser. This can, regardless of that, this can be useful, but you have to be aware of its restrictions. So this works, but only on pattern. Wonderful. Okay, so rewriting a native error message is possible in theory, but you don't really want to do it. Now, how do we show native error messages? When do they actually pop up? That brings us to the complicated subject of native error messages. Again, this is what I'm talking about, right? This sort of automated error messages that the browser shows when you submit the form. The third example on my example page, the native error messages one, is a pure native error messages test. I do nothing fancy. It's just exactly how the browser performs this. So you can try that and figure out what's actually going on in the browser while I slowly tell you about it, and also tell you about the terrible stuff that is going wrong everywhere. So when exactly does the browser show error messages? When the user submits a form, but it shows only the first error, which, as far as I'm concerned, is only moderately useful. I would vastly have preferred the browser to show all the form validation errors. And the second way of showing an error message is the report validity method. The report validity method returns true or false, field is valid or invalid, just like check validity. But in addition, if the field is found to be invalid, it shows the error message. Now this is interesting. Now we are getting somewhere. This is actually a method we would like to use, right? Oh yeah, and this is a wonderful, brilliant Edge-only thing. Once you have validated the entire form, and then when you click on one of the form fields, Edge, and only Edge, shows the error message again. This is absolutely brilliant, and I would like the other browsers to implement it as well. Because this is exactly what you need. Oh, this form field was invalid, but why again? Click, that was a problem. Okay, I'll fix it. Great. So these are the three ways of showing native error messages in the browser. Oh yeah, and when it does, the field automatically gains the focus, which is useful because the user can immediately start typing. If you submit the form in Edge and Firefox only, all the invalid fields get a red outline, which is also a very useful trick. You will see that on my test page if you use Edge or Firefox. So this is roughly how error messages are being shown. What did I do now? I did it wrong. So we have to go through this entire slide again, which is kind of okay because this is important information, right? Report validity, report validity. Now we are getting somewhere. So how are we actually going to trigger our native error messages in browsers? Remember, we want to call that onblur because that is the superior form validation timing. We don't want to call it onSubmit. Well, you can call them onSubmit. It's fine as a fallback method, but onblur is much more user-friendly. So, we have to use report validity. By the way, report validity is not supported in the version of Edge I tested. I hope support comes soon. But let's ignore that for now, because we're on the roll, right? So this is what we are going to need. We set a simple blur event listener, and if the target of that blur is an input, we call it report validity method, right? By the way, before I continue, I'm using true here, which means I'm using the blur event in the capturing phase. Who here has no clue what I'm talking about and why I do this? Some of you. See me later. It's a trick. No, okay, I'll mention it very briefly. Events, in theory, bubble up, right? If I click on an input, the input on click is executed and then goes up to the label and to the section and to the form, blah, 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 all the way up to the document. That is normal events bubbling. However, some events don't bubble, among which blur for historical reasons. However, these events are captured, which is basically doing it the other way around. So you start at the document, then you go to the body, then to the form, then to the field, etc., etc. And then all of a sudden, you can set a generic event listener for an entire form, as I'm doing here. You can do that, but you have to use true. Read up, and it's not really part of my course presentation, because I want to show you what's coming next. Again, we set an event listener for blur, and if the blur occurs on an input, we report the validity of that input, and if the validity is false, it shows the error message, right? No. Well, theoretically, yes. In practice, no. Epic. Epic. Absolutely epic. You can see it for yourself. On the fourth and final test page I created for you, you first focus on one field. You don't change anything, so that field remains invalid. And then you focus on another field, in Chrome or Safari. You're seeing it, right? You can't. The focus remains stuck on the first field. Edge and Firefox, by the way, do this kind of okay, but not wonderful. But they are a lot better than Chrome and Safari. What is going on here? Why doesn't this simple, easy trick just work, right? One thing we haven't discussed yet is hiding error messages. We now know how to show error messages, but when does the browser actually hide the error messages? It turns out there are several answers to this question. Most browsers, Edge, Firefox, and Safari, hide it when the user scrolls. Why? Probably for technical reasons. It's certainly not for user interface reason. I mean, it makes absolutely no sense to hide an error message when the user scrolls, right? Chrome does something else. It hides the error messages after 5 seconds have elapsed, which I suppose is better than scrolling, but not a lot better. Also, in some cases, the error message disappears when the field receives focus, though this is a complicated subject. However, what none of the browsers do is wait until the field becomes valid, which to me personally would be the ideal timing to hide an error message, right? I'm just suggesting, you know. I mean, it would be really useful if the error message stays around to inform the user of what he has to do in order to correct the error, right? It doesn't. Browsers are weird, but you already knew that. Anyway, with this knowledge in mind, we can find out what happened in Safari and Chrome. What happens is the following. A blur event occurs, right? The user leaves the form field because the user has filled it in. The script is triggered. That's perfectly normal. That's exactly what we want to happen. Report validity fires. This is also what we want to happen, right? It's in our script and finds the field is invalid. So the browser shows the native error message, which so far exactly what we want is happening. Then the field receives the focus that it has just lost because the user has to type in the improved field value. And then the error message disappears, because the error message disappears when you focus on the field. You're starting to understand what a fun thing browser compatibility research is, right? I mean, it took me, I can't remember how long, but a pretty long time before I finally figured out what was going on here. Whatever. I'm sorry, I can't help you here. This is probably the most downbeat slide of my entire presentation. The whole using onblur and report validity together is just not going to work. And that means that native error messages are completely useless. This is an official conclusion. You can quote me on this. So, how do we prevent the native error messages from showing up? We already touched on one thing, the no-validate attribute on a form. If you set the no-validate attribute on a form, the browser just doesn't do native error message checking, which is kind of cool. Incidentally, the API continues to work, which is important, as we'll see in a moment. There's a second way to prevent an error message from showing, and that's returning false on the invalid event. Who here has heard of the invalid event? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. There is an invalid event. And it fires when a field is found to be invalid during the submission process, or when you use either check validity or report validity. And this is seriously cool. We could definitely use this event. For instance, to show an error message. Not a native error message, because they don't work, but maybe a custom error message. Its default action is showing the native error message. So if you cancel that default action by returning false or doing prevent default, it does not show the native error message. So now you know how to suppress native error messages in the browser on a case-by-case basis, which could be useful for you later on. I think this is a pretty good idea. All browsers support this, as far as I know, so it works. But there's another good idea that kind of logically follows from the invalid event, valid event. Who here thinks that a valid event would also be a good idea? Who here thinks that browsers support a valid event? They don't, which is a pity. Anyway, I think I've brought you down, right? You're now badly in need of a cup of coffee and somebody who you can talk to and who understands you. I'm going to end with a few practical notes. They're not mind-blowing or anything, but I had promised trying to end on this note, so I'll do that. First of all, let's take the positive approach. What can we use of all of that we've now seen? Valid and invalid are kind of useful, provided we use the not focus trick, right? Only show the styles when the user does not currently focus on the field. Validity.valid and friends are very useful because you can actually figure out what's wrong with a form field. Turning off native error messages is also very useful. You know, it's a sad commentary on native error messages that the most useful part of them is turning them off. So, where do we go from here? If you want to create a form that uses the required attribute or the pattern attribute or date fields, number fields, and so on and so forth, I think you should do the following. First of all, set no validate on the form. Secondly, I would strongly suggest you use this HTML, right, with the label. I already talked about that. But again, this is a personal preference of mine. Maybe you hate it, so then don't use it. Then with the CSS, just use a simple class on the label, right? This is not CSS, this is JavaScript. We set a valid or an invalid class, which is also useful because it gives us the indeterminate state I talked about earlier, right? If the label does not have a class at all, we don't know yet if the field is valid or invalid. So that's CSS-wise. And then for JavaScript, suppress the native error messages. Can do this again. When I was on stage, I realized that I had not tested one thing, the no validate whether this is still necessary when you also have a no-validate attribute. I'm assuming it's not, but I put it here in here to be on the safe side. So you can suppress native error messages if you want. You trigger your form validation on blur, of course, because that's the optimal timing. And if the target turns out to be an input, you call your custom function validate field. I would advise you to also use an onSubmit event handler. You know, it's a kind of a backup. If the user doesn't go to some of the form fields at all, onblur will never fire, but onSubmit will. So it's a useful fallback. Then the actual validation is extremely simple. I am going to use validity.valid here. You can also use validity.pattern mismatch or whatever you like. That is the nice thing about the whole validity thing. You can actually figure out exactly why a field is invalid. If the field is valid, if the field is not valid, you set the class to invalid. If the field is valid and has a value, important detail, set the class to valid. And all other cases, remove both classes with indeterminate. This is really it. I mean, I'm not telling you anything earth-shattering here, but I spent 3 weeks on this research, I guess. And when this is what I can come up with, this is the best I can come up with, you know we have a problem. So what's to be done? I'm not going to tell you here because my third article that's linked on my test page contains a long list of, I think, 14, 16 bullet points of things I think should be improved. You can read that for yourself. It also contains a few things I did not talk about, because I did not talk about max length and min length. You can find that out for yourself, or run away screaming, whatever you like. So I hope I didn't bring you too much down. There are some gems hidden in here, but it's pretty hard to find them. And with that, my presentation is over. Thank you so much. I'll put these slides online, and I think Matthias is going to grill me now.
That was a pretty sad talk.
Yeah.
But interesting at the same time.
Yeah, depressing but interesting. That's
yeah, exactly. That's what you were going for?
Yeah.
Nice.
That's who I am, right?
So you did some of this research for Samsung, right?
Yes.
So does that mean you filed bugs with them, or are they...
Not particularly. It was more that I said, hey, I would like to do this, and they said, yeah, sure, we'll support you.
Okay.
It was in the context of a complicated job, doesn't matter. But
yeah,
it's not...
I got a little excited about maybe some of these smaller bugs getting fixed in Chromium or in other browsers as a result. But
yeah. Well, there was a very practical timing issue for me. Once I had actually created the entire list of problems, and I had written it down, and I had submitted the articles, I went on holiday. And then when I came back, I had to organize all kinds of conferences. So no, I haven't gotten around to it yet. Besides, as far as I can see, most of this is not actually a bug, but a feature. Not all of it, and to be honest, I'm not totally sure, but I am fairly certain that what I see here will mostly not be a bug, but this is how it works. Maybe we should rethink it. That would be a great idea.
Right. Is it possible to style the the browser validity messages, the native ones?
It is not. One more reason not to use them. By the way, they're also completely invisible to any accessibility technology. Ooh. You just don't see them. Well, because why would you, right?
That's interesting.
Yes, it is.
Speaking of accessibility, is it okay to wrap the error message into the label that corresponds to the input?
Why would it not be? I mean, I'm not an accessibility specialist. If somebody steps up and say, hey, this is a really bad idea, then I believe you. But as far as I know, what you do with the error message is initially you hide it, of course, and then you show it, and I'm sure there is something in accessibility technology where you say, like, hey, something has appeared.
Hidden or something?
Yes, there has to be an ARIA attribute. I'm not an expert on ARIA, so I left that out, but unless somebody tells me I'm wrong right here and right now, I'm going to assume that this could be made accessible.
Now's your time, everyone.
1.
No? Yep.
Yeah.
Mr. Opportunity.
Okay.
Is it possible to get the native text from the error messages in the browser
yes.
and then reuse them?
Yes, it is. I think it's called validation message or something. It's form field. I think it's form field dot validation message, but I have to look it up. But yes, it's possible.
That sounds rather useful if you want to implement custom styling for this. So you can take the message that the browser would provide in the user's own language, and then reuse that in your own UI.
In theory, yes, but in practice, I don't like the native, the default text so much.
Right. Okay.
It's mostly conform to this pattern. Which pattern? Doesn't tell you.
Right.
So if you go for, I mean, you should just go for writing your own error messages.
Do it yourself. That's what we're used to as web developers anyway.
Yes.
So.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for your talk.
Welcome.